So the whole plan looked great on paper and could have worked, maybe. My name is Kevin, and this is History Goon. Now, if the quote didn't give it away, we're about to talk about something that didn't work out so hot. And then at the end of it, we're going to talk about some conspiracy theories that follow it that may have actually been proven to be facts later on. But this week, we are talking about the Bay of Pigs invasion and then Operation Northwoods. Oh boy. The two main events that we're going to discuss take place in 1961 and 1962. But to get to the root of the problem, we still kind of have to go back a little bit further. And as we go, again, we can make a connection, like a pretty solid connection, to a few other pretty big events throughout history, like, the Vietnam War, the assassination of JFK, and we can also tie the September 11th terrorist attack on the World Trade Center into this whole thing too. Which is really weird to think about. To think that by going back to 1959 Cuba, we're going to make a connection to New York City in 2001. So it's going to get weird. It's going to get weird. You may want to stop now and go grab the tinfoil for the end. Because like I said, it's going to be very, very odd. And it's not like I'm just pulling this stuff out of my ass. This is all provable facts for the most part. Aside from, like the whole who killed JFK thing and the whole who was really behind 9/11 thing and the whole what actually caused us to go to Vietnam thing. So why don't we let's just get into it, Let's just get after it here. The Cuban Revolution was fought between the Cuban government and a Marxist communist group led by Fidel Castro and notoriously one of my least favorite people that's ever existed, Che Guevara. I know there's a group of people out there that probably have Che Guevara t-shirts and, have stickers like Smash Capitalism on their like Yeti or MacBook Pro or whatever. They've tweeted that from their brand new iPhone, talking about how much they hate capitalism, even though they're a direct product of it. And if communism was so cool, you wouldn't have your brand new MacBook. You wouldn't have your brand new iPhone. You wouldn't be able to say stuff like that without some dude in a fuzzy hat showing up at your house and being like, neat, now turn around and face the wall. Because communism is not my favorite thing ever. Matter of fact, I'm very much against it. Hot take. I know I've made that point before within the last couple episodes, but any chance I get to shit on communism, I'm going to. And if you don't like that, I apologize, and this might not be the show for you. Not that capitalism is perfect, because it's not, right? Like, there is problems with it. But you can criticize it and not be executed by an agent of the state. So maybe it is better. Who knows? It's also worked a bunch of places. Anyway, back to Che Guevara. He was a racist, believe it or not. No matter what Tom Morello from Rage Against the Machine wants to tell you, he was a racist. He helped to build forced labor camps for gays and any other unwanteds, and wasn't a big fan of freedom of the press. Kind of all tracks with communism. After years of fighting, the bad guys won. On January 1st, 1959, the commies took over in Cuba, and this was a huge problem for the United States because this would bring the creeping red menace directly to our doorstep. And Another important point to make here is part of the reason that Castro wanted to take over the Cuban government was to get rid of the US-backed president turned dictator. That happens occasionally. General Fulgencio Batista. Ironically, Castro would become a pretty brutal dictator in his own right. It's almost like if you give one man control of your country, he's gonna do whatever he wants. If you give a commie a cookie, I guess. On January 7th of 1959, Secretary of State John Dulles sent a letter to Vice President Richard Nixon saying, quote, "The provisional government appears free from communist taint." He's so wrong. There are indicators that it intends to pursue friendly relations with the United States. So he was wrong twice in the same sentence. A few days later, January 19th, during Fidel Castro's first post-revolution trip to Washington, he met with Vice President Richard Nixon. They hung out for about 3.5 hours. Nixon had this to say about the meeting, quote, "I spent as much time as I could trying to emphasize that he had a great gift of leadership, but that it was the responsibility of a leader not always to follow public opinion, but to help to direct it in proper channels, not to give the people what they think they want at a time of emotional stress, but to make them want what they ought to have." You don't hate politicians enough. I promise. No matter how much you hate them, you don't hate them enough. The vice president reports a 4-page secret memo to Eisenhower, Secretary of State Christian A. Herter, and Allen Dulles. Quote, "It was apparent that while he paid lip service to such institutions as freedom of speech, press, and religion, that his primary concern was with developing programs for economic progress." Nixon came to the conclusion that Castro is either, quote, "either incredibly naive about communism or is under communist discipline." It's the second one, I promise. It's the second one. But he also had his own appraisal of Castro as a man. Quote, "The one fact we can be sure is that he has those indefinable qualities which make him a leader of men. Whatever we might think of him, he is going to be a great factor in the development of Cuba and very possibly in the development of Latin American affairs generally." He's absolutely right about that. Because, not sure if you're new here or not, Fidel Castro was in power for a very long time. I think he died in did he die in 2010 or something? I don't remember. Wow, I was way wrong. He died November 25th, 2016. So he was in power for, almost 50 years, right? He was in power for almost 60 years. He was the president, in big giant air quotes, of Cuba for 57 years. I'm sure most of those were fair and unmessed with elections as well. This meeting stemmed from a plan that had been learned about where Castro was planning to nationalize a bunch of industries and redistribute wealth and a bunch of land to who knows what, which obviously that's the big thing with communism is we have to take everybody's stuff, gather it all up, take what we want out of it first, and then give the people back what we think they should have, which is usually not enough. The Holodomor or whatever it was in Ukraine, where, I don't know, a couple million people starved to death. There was one that I kind of wish had, but he didn't. Andre Chikatilo, eating rock soup and stuff. Man, if that guy had died, I don't think anybody would have been upset. Maybe his mom. Probably not, though. She gave birth to a monster, so. This became a problem for the U.S. because a bunch of the industries that he's trying to take back over and redistribute were owned by U.S. companies. After a series of meetings between the two governments, things started to deteriorate pretty quickly between the U.S. and Cuba, and in late October, President Dwight D. Eisenhower authorized a plan with the CIA, there's helicopters somewhere, to try and overthrow the Castro regime. Not that the CIA would ever do that. I had a pretty lengthy list last week, so go back and listen to that if you want to hear me potentially get put on a list of some sort. I mean, obviously, this is not the first time the U.S. government's tried to overthrow another government. This isn't even the first time that they've tried to overthrow the government of Cuba. I mean, the first time they were successful, but, you know, at this point, we hadn't really hit our stride of figuring out how to arm belligerent groups and pay them correctly to attempt to get rid of a dictator or government that we didn't particularly like. But you can't succeed if you don't try. Remember that, kids. This plan was to back and arm a group of anti-Castro Cuban exiles to perform raids from the U.S. into Cuba with the overall hope that they could dispose of, or even better, kill Fidel Castro. In early to mid-November, a man named Manuel Artemi takes part in a secret 2-day meeting of National Institute of Agrarian Reform, which took place in Havana. He was standing there, notebook in hand, when Castro and Che Guevara walk in, and the room exploded. Unfortunately, it was in applause and not with some type of artillery or plastic explosive. He took meticulous notes on everything said during the meeting, especially when it focused on, quote, the true goals of the revolution. Artemi quoted Castro in his notes, quote, this, a meeting of a group of men who know the road on which to take the people, that freely discuss the things they're going to do, having in their hands all the power of the state to do it. This is why, as much as I hate how our system of government works most of the time, it's still better than this. During the meeting, Castro also tells everyone in the room that private property is now a thing of the past, which, again, shouldn't come as much of a surprise because that's pretty boilerplate commie stuff. Later in the month, Artemi would sneak off to Mexico and link up with a group of other Cuban exiles who had been stockpiling weapons and ammo in hopes of someday taking their country back from the Castro regime. Which is funny that Mexico is a haven for these Cuban exiles and people trying to escape communism. When you look at it today, it's the same thing, but for professional baseball players, which is wild. There is so many Cuban guys that play in MLB that they have a very similar story. I was good enough to play for the state team for the Cuban national team or whatever. We played a bunch of games in Cuba against other teams. Then we went to whatever Central American country, played a bunch of teams there, went and played some teams down in South America, got to Mexico, played them, and then I just ran away. And they're like, once I run away and figure out a way to become a Mexican citizen, the Cuban government can't take me back anymore. They can't tell me what I can and can't do. And then from here, I can go make just millions of dollars playing baseball in the major leagues. And then if I want to become a citizen there, it's wild. There was, I think it was Yasiel Puig has a really interesting story about how he did it. And I think Randy Rosarino was another one. I know he came from Cuba, went to Mexico because he played for Mexico's World Baseball Classic team a few years ago. Anyway, I'm on the baseball-tism again, and I need to stop that. Because this is not about baseball. This is about communism. While Cuban students and exiles are stockpiling, a memo from Secretary of State Christian Herter hits Eisenhower's desk saying the following, quote, all actions of the United States government should be designed to encourage within Cuba and elsewhere in Latin America opposition to the extremist anti-American course of the Castro regime. He then added, quote, however, in achieving this objective, the United States should avoid giving the impression of direct pressure or intervention against Castro, except where defense of legitimate United States interests are involved. So we need to make sure that we're not, quote unquote, not involved with the government overthrow part, because we don't want to be involved with that at all. We don't want anybody to think that we did. We can step in to protect our own interests, like our companies and our factories and stuff like that are in Cuba. Totally cool to step in and protect those. But the rest of it, we didn't do anything like that. You can see, the start of the idea of how to get rid of Castro is forming. December 11th, 1959, the head of the CIA's Western Division writes a memorandum for Richard Bissell, who was a counterintelligence officer at the CIA. And he also sends that same letter to CIA Director Allen Dulles, stating that Castro has now established a dictatorship of the far left. The intelligence community estimates an increase in Cuban support for other revolutionary movements in Latin America and, quote, rapid nationalization of the banks, industry, and commerce sectors. Yeah. You start nationalizing all that stuff and you are in, like, severely deep. The memorandum states that, quote, violent action is the only means of breaking Castro's grip on power, listing as the U.S. objective, quote, the overthrow of Castro within 1 year. 57 years later, it didn't work. King also recommended that, quote, thorough consideration be given to the elimination of Fidel Castro. So, we're getting the idea out there and on paper that this guy has to go, like, expeditiously, with prejudice, get rid of his ass. The whole thing. This memo is the first time that the idea of killing Fidel Castro is actually put on paper. Other than that, it's just been talking behind closed doors and all that, but now it's officially on paper, which means now it's more likely to be considered than just after a couple of scotches and smoking butts and be like, maybe we should kill this guy. Now that they have a plan in their heads, it's time to start preparing. Keep in mind, Eisenhower signed off on this plan knowing that he was leaving office in January of 1960 and that this is about to become John F. Kennedy's problem because he's coming in after he absolutely decimated Richard Nixon in the election. Part of the reasoning for that is because he had a very, very tough stance on what's going on in Cuba and communism in general. And Nixon didn't really have all that much to say about the Cuba situation. Nixon had so little to say because he's already privy to this idea of having Castro assassinated. So he kind of wants to keep his mouth shut because if he had won the election and he'd been running his mouth about wanting to do something about Cuba, and then all of a sudden Fidel Castro's head explodes, maybe it looks a little suspicious, maybe it looks a little pre-planned. Also, this was the first presidential election where debates were televised and people could look at JFK and they could look at Richard Nixon and go, this man looks like a pug in a Halloween mask. This man's handsome and his wife is a smoke show. I think we're going to elect this guy, like the handsome dude with the hot wife, not Richard Nixon, who, spoiler alert, does become president later on. Like a few years later, not like the next election cycle, not a couple years later, that's Lyndon Johnson that becomes president a couple years later. We'll get there. Ooh, it's already coming in. I can feel it. In the beginning of January 1960, the company, which is, the CIA, set up Task Force WH4, which I can't prove that the WH is White House, but it makes a little bit of sense. They set this up to put the plan that Eisenhower signed off on. They want to put that into play. From here, a series of small bombing runs into Cuba. Incendiary bombs were dropped in the area of Banoa, Cabarrillo, and San Antonio de Rio Blanco. One of the planes that flew in and bombed the Hershey factory had very, very, from the ground, very visible U.S. markings on it. Not a great look. For the rest of January, small attacks were made, a plane dropping phosphorus bombs on a sugarcane plantation. 7 people were arrested in Sagua La Grande. for trying to derail a train headed to Cuba. Plane dropped a 400-pound bomb on the small village of Coimar y Regula, which is like a kind of like a suburb almost of Havana. Then on January 25th, Eisenhower held a press conference where he said Castro has become, quote, an anti-American madman. He also hinted that something needed to be done about the Cubans, even though something was being done about the Cubans preemptively. March 17th, 1960. At an Oval Office meeting with high-ranking national security officials, President Eisenhower approved a CIA policy paper titled, quote, a program of covert action against the Castro regime. It's a little wordy for me, and I'm kind of disappointed you guys didn't have like a horrible nickname for it, because the government is awful at naming stuff like that. I mean, they got like Operation Gothic Serpent, which sounds awesome, but it was a really bad time. Operation Enduring Freedom, which like that should come with an eagle sound. It sounds awesome. Also a really bad time. The CIA plan involves 4 main courses of action. Form a moderate opposition group in exile whose slogan will be to restore the revolution which Castro has betrayed. Create a medium-wave radio station to broadcast into Cuba, probably on Swan Island, which is south of Cuba. Create a covert intelligence and action organization within Cuba responsive to the orders and directions of the exile opposition. And begin training a paramilitary force outside of Cuba, and in the second phase, train paramilitary cadres for immediate deployment into Cuba to organize, train, and lead resistance forces that were recruited there. During the meeting, Eisenhower states that he knows of, quote, no better plan for dealing with this situation, but is a little concerned about leakage and breach of security. Understandable. Because if it comes out publicly that you're trying to assassinate the president of another country, that might make you look bad. You know, he argues that everyone must be prepared to deny its existence, and only 2 or 3 people should have any contact with the groups involved, agitating Cubans to do most of what must be done. The president tells Allen Dulles that he thinks that he should go ahead with the plan and the operations, but that, quote, our hand should not show in anything that is done. Again, secret squirrel stuff. March 20th to 21st, 1960, internal resistance forces destroy 400,000 arrobas of cane in the Kunagawa Central. Kunagawa sounds Japanese anyway. Central and Camagüey province. I don't speak Spanish. I slept through most of 9th grade Spanish, but I needed a foreign language credit to graduate. So, planes caused 7 fires in the zone bordering Matanzas, Las Villas. I do know that if there's 2 L's together, it's a Y, not 2 L's. It's not tortillas. In the Las Villas, these bombings affected a couple of different Australian sugar refineries, which no big deal. They're an ally. They'll get it, you know. January 4th, 1961. Senior CIA officials prepare a memorandum, quote, to outline the status of preparations for the conduct of amphibious/airborne and tactical air operations against the government of Cuba, and to set forth certain requirements for policy decisions which must be reached and implemented if these operations are to be carried out. The concept of the plan, from what I could gather, and I have a little bit of a quote here, quote, the initial mission of the invasion force will be to seize and defend a small area. There will be no early attempt to break out of the lodgment for further offensive operations unless and until there is a general uprising against the Castro regime or overt military intervention by United States forces has taken place. It is expected that these operations will precipitate a general uprising throughout Cuba and cause the revolt of a large segment of the Cuban army and militia. If matters do not eventuate as predicted above, the lodgment can be used as a site for establishment of a provisional government that can be recognized by the United States. The way will then be paved for United States military intervention aimed at pacification of Cuba, and this will result in the prompt overthrow of the Castro regime. Airstrikes are seen as a crucial component of the invasion. Quote, It is considered crucial that the Cuban Air Force and naval vessels capable of opposing the landing be knocked out or neutralized before amphibious shipping makes its final run into the beach. That's from a CIA memo for Chief WH4 policy decisions required for conducting of strike operations against government of Cuba. Whew, man, government stuff, like, super dry to read. And I had to do a FOIA request at one point for some of this stuff, so it gets a little dry in spots. January 5th, 1961, in preparation for a January 5th meeting of the special group, Tracy Barnes drafted a memorandum for the Director of Central Intelligence in which he outlines problems that need to be addressed. Most importantly, he argued that contrary views expressed at a January 3rd meeting, the operation is unable to house or train more than like 750 strike force members. Further, he makes the argument that the operation should have a U.S. base for resupplying following the strike landing, which islands are notoriously hard to fight on. Not just for, usually for the defenders, because they're hard to resupply. Like that's a reason that Japan had such a hard time once we actually started fighting in the Pacific, is because we would cut off supply lines and they had no way to get food and ammunition to like certain smaller islands that we could take and then use for like jumping off points to go into other places. Now, this is going to be hard for these guys to fight. And we'll understand why in a few minutes. Spoiler alert, Cuba does not need to resupply while we're doing this. Early in mid-April 1961, anticipating an invasion, Fidel Castro begins preparations for Cuba's defense. He concentrates troops close to the most probable landing points throughout the island, particularly near access zones to the mountains, especially near like Trinidad, where the Escambray guerrillas have been eliminated in March. So that was a guerrilla faction of Cubans that were trying to do guerrilla stuff. Another thing that Castro is kind of anticipating here is that if there's going to be an invasion, they're most likely going to try to knock out all of their ships and planes, which that's part of the plan. So he has a pretty good idea here. We're going to take all of the active planes away from the runways and stuff and put anything that's like broken down or out of service, tagged out or whatever. We're going to put those little groups of 3 so that they're nice targets, right? And then we're going to have spots around those that we're going to set up these big camouflage nets. And we've got surprises in the form of anti-aircraft guns under those big camouflage nets. April 17th, 1961, the invasion begins. The Bay of Pigs was selected because the CIA thought it would look less suspicious having a landing spot there because it's on the southern half of the island, as opposed to coming in from the north, which is like immediately like, hey, this is the United States because there's nobody else north of us. I mean, south of us, there's other people, but we're pretty good with them. But in the long run, landing on the northern half of the island would have turned out to be a much better idea because it's more densely forested and it would have been a lot easier to find cover, concealment, and sneak out of the way. The Cuban exiles that have become known as Brigade 2506 landed on the Bay of Pigs. So before we get into the absolute show that's going to take place, we need to let's hop back one day real quick so we can talk about some American B-26 bombers that are very poorly painted to look like Cuban aircraft. This was done in hopes that some of Castro's cronies would see this and think the military had turned on them. And that failed miserably. Not only were a bunch of pictures taken of the planes, but the bombers also failed to knock out the entirety of the actual Cuban Air Force, which would be a huge mistake. On board one of the escort ships that was called the Balagar, Gray Lynch, who's one of the CIA coordinators, got a memo stating, quote, Castro still has operational aircraft. Expect you to be hit at dawn. Unload all troops and supplies and take ships to sea as soon as possible. So instead of taking the information and the failure of knocking out these Cuban aircraft and going, yep, let's try it again later, we're just going to go for it. It's one of those get we ball moments. And turns out we're not good at ball right here. When the U.S.-backed exiles landed and started unloading, they came under immediate gunfire from local forces, which in turn got word back to the military as a whole. Castro is woken up by one of his aides, and he orders troops to be sent to counterattack this immediately. So we're about to not be dealing with local militia anymore. We're about to be dealing with the Cuban military proper, and that's going to be a little bit of a problem. And that's a little bit of a problem because Castro sent over 900 men, including 3 mortar batteries, out here to fight these guys. And as these guys are mobilizing, the Air Force are spinning up the engines and getting ready for a fight. So as all of this is going on, a CIA message goes out to the Cuban military, quote, take up strategic positions and take control of roads and railways. Make prisoners or shoot those who refuse to obey your orders. All planes must stay on the ground. See that no Fidelist planes take off. Destroy its radios, destroy its tail, break its instruments, puncture its fuel tanks. So this is us trying to convince the military that they're receiving orders from somebody that's kind of turned on Fidel Castro. Throughout the day, the station suggests the exile force is succeeding. Quote, the invaders are advancing steadily on every front. Castro's forces are surrendering in droves. So this is the CIA at its absolute finest, just wheeling and dealing, cooking up some misinformation and disinformation. Oh, this part's insane. They also started a rumor that when the invasion started, Raul Castro killed himself. This was like, without doubt, trying to get Fidel to make a little bit of a misstep and allow the rebels to take control. The problem is, when that message went out over the radio saying that Raul Castro has killed himself, Fidel Castro heard that message and looked over at his brother Raul and went, huh, you did a really bad job of killing yourself, basically. Because in our infinite wisdom of trying to do something like this, instead of sending somebody in there like a couple days earlier to actually kill him or something, we're just going to like completely just throw at the wall and see what sticks. And it's hard to sell a rumor about somebody killing themselves when they get to hear the message and go, "Oh man, I guess I didn't." You know. At around 6:30 a.m., some of the beach landings are canceled due to some of these small aluminum boats that are being used having engine problems. So these are just like little aluminum, like fishing boats, Somali pirate ships, if you will. This resulted in only 2 of the 9 boats being able to go back and forth the 40-minute round trip from the beach back to the Houston and then back. The Houston is the ship where all the guys are stationed. This is going to cause a lack of manpower, shortage of supplies. It's a really, really bad thing. Again, never been in the military, never been in law enforcement, not a tactical genius. I think as soon as I had 7 of my 9 boats die, I'd have gone, I think it's time to call this off. Let's just get our boys back and go home. I don't know. As troops are going from the Houston back to shore, the Houston takes a direct rocket hit from a Cuban Sea Fury. And after it's hit, it runs aground about 5 miles away from the beachhead with 180 men on board. Another Cuban plane damages the LCI Barbara J with machine gun firing, killing 2 of the engines. While that's going on, a group of men land from the air and seize a large intersection in San Blas, about 10 miles inland from the beach, and set up an outpost to keep eyes on any incoming Cuban reinforcements. So far, the air invasion is the only thing that's actually going somewhat to plan. At around 9:30 a.m., another Sea Fury scores a direct rocket hit on the Rio Escondido, which is a freighter ship off the shore that just so happens to have had hospital supplies. Um, had hospital supplies, 10 days of provisions, a heap of ammo, and a big stockpile of gasoline. Um, that's what we like to refer to as foreshadowing. Men from the Houston launched a rescue mission and actually evacuated the Escondido before it exploded. One of the American troops on shore called back to the Houston after the explosion and asked if they had been nuked. That's how big this explosion was. At 10 a.m., the captains of the ships, so like the escort ships were not military craft, but they were actually like commercial freighters and large fishing ships. So these captains told the CIA men aboard that they're like, hey, if we're going to keep getting targeted by jets, we're done. We're going to turn our ships around and we're going to head back out to sea, because just because you commandeered our stuff doesn't mean that we are willing to die, or even worse, lose our livelihoods by having these ships sunk. At 10:30, a couple of them did exactly that. They turned and headed back to sea and didn't stop until they met U.S. naval craft. Not long after noon, the troops that had landed in San Blas come under fire and they start trying to call for backup. Unfortunately, they had no communications because the guys landing on the beach had to wade to shore and their radios had all become waterlogged hunks of useless plastic. So we've got a bunch of dudes, like 10 miles inland in enemy territory, that can't communicate with anybody back at the beach, because everybody back at the beach has dead radios. And I'm assuming at that point, they would have to, in a perfect world, they were probably calling back to the beach so that they can call back to the ship. Meaning, we're alone. We've got nothing that we can't go anywhere. But luckily for them, a bunch of Cuban tanks start rolling in, so they retreated. The bad thing is, with this, is after the Cuban tanks start rolling in, artillery starts hitting the beachhead. US B-26 bombers start circling the beach and drop a couple of bombs, and they sink a Cuban gunship, killing the entire crew. And they supposedly dropped one on the beach and killed a bunch of Cuban troops, but that second part isn't actually confirmed. It's more, well, we did this. Nobody really knows. In retaliation, the Cubans scrambled more jets and shot down 4 B-26s. For the remainder of the night, the Cubans chased the exiles and U.S. troops through the coastal marshes as tourists call into local authorities reporting the sounds of gunfire and explosions near the areas they're staying at. These dudes are in a running gunfight, basically going through like resorts, which has got to be wild, or like a Thursday in Mexico. And I only say that because I know people that have been to Mexico to go to these resorts, and they've been told, hey, don't leave, because there's a good chance that if you do, you may get kidnapped. Who knows? At around 2 p.m., Castro feels confident that the capital is safe and sets out for the combat zone to set up his command center. At this point, Cuban Special Forces, which I didn't know were a thing, had been chasing the landing force around for the better part of 12 hours. So they're chasing the landing force around. The landing force is they were trying to get like set up in Playa Larga and try to like hunker down there a little bit to maybe hope that we're getting reinforcements. This is a wild number. Cuban troops, now numbering nearly 20,000, continued to hunt and kill the exile forces until the 19th, when some of the exiles tried to flee by sea. 100+ members of the invading forces were killed and another 1,200 were captured. The U.S. would start negotiations for the release of prisoners almost immediately, but the process would take nearly 20 months. That's almost 2 years of negotiating to get these guys back. Attorney General Robert Kennedy would take control of the negotiations personally with Castro. He would then go plead with pharmaceutical companies, which his son would hate. His dad's like, hey, Big Pharma, help me. Don't get me wrong. I like RFK Jr. I just like the the difference here where like his dad's like, we need to get these pharmaceutical companies to help us. And he's like, those guys, get your ads off TV, which I agree with because pharmaceutical ads are gross. Do you have an itchy patch in your elbow? Take this medication that may make you legitimately want to kill yourself. Your itchy skin will be gone though. So he's pleading with pharmaceutical companies, baby food companies, all these different like aid organizations to send as much stuff to Cuba as they can in return for the prisoners. After further negotiation, the U.S. and Cuba would settle on $53 million worth of medical and humanitarian aid in exchange for the prisoners. And all of this happened, like this exchange would take place 2 months after the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I need to cover at some point in time. Because that is probably legitimately the closest we have been so far to a nuclear war. Very, very tense. Very high pucker factor at that point in history. The first plane load of prisoners was returned to the United States, again, a couple of months after the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Because we're not negotiating for that while things are this tense. That's insane. Are you crazy? The whole thing was bungled from the time the first set of boots hit sand. And all of that, everything that went wrong, would fall directly on the Kennedy administration. A lot of people say unfairly because it was actually his predecessor that set everything up and initiated the plan. But since he's in office while it was carried out, it fell on him. And it was kind of a black mark on JFK's very short presidency. Some people went as far as to say that the failure to eliminate Castro is ultimately what cost him his life in Dallas, November 22nd of 1963. Now, the Kennedy assassination is not something that I'm just going to like, we're never going to talk about that. I want to do that at some point in time, but there's a lot of research that goes into that. Especially the conspiracy theories, because, oh my God, are there just some restaurant quality ones? Like, a few of my favorites. The Cubans killed him. Sure, why not? The Mafia killed him. Maybe, who knows? The CIA killed him, that's like, everybody knows that, or the FBI, whichever. Then there's the, Mossad killed him because he wasn't necessarily like Israel's best friend as a president. He may or may not have, without calling them out, called them out on some stuff. And, I mean, we all know. We know exactly what Mossad would do to people. There's some weird ones. And then there's like the least obvious one that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. And then Jack Ruby killed him because he just loved JFK and didn't want to see this guy get away with it. And then I think somebody else killed him, which is weird because that's kind of like how like an assassination would work. You're tying up loose ends and keeping people from telling stories. But I don't really know where I fall with it. And I don't know. I don't think it was Lee Harvey Oswald. I think he was just a easy patsy because he had been in Russia at one point in time. He was a Marine. He was a really good shot, blah, blah, blah. Scapegoat. Do I think that there was a shooter on the grassy knoll? Probably, because, like, if you watch the video, the back of his head, like, just explodes, right? And generally, if the entrance wound had been there, would have been exit wound in the front. The exit wounds are much larger than entry wounds. Then there's also the theory that the guy sitting in front of him shot him, which is ridiculous. I don't know. There's so many. Um, it ranks right up there when it comes to conspiracies. No, that's it. That's the one for like assassinations and stuff. The other one I really like, but I'm not going to do it because I'm not doing true crime on here, is like, who was actually the Zodiac killer? I know people are like, oh, it was Ted Cruz because he looks just like him. Tell you what, pretty sure Ted Cruz was like 4 when that happened. But you know who does match the drawings pretty well and was in the area at the time and was like in his late teens, early 20s when he did it? Do yourself a favor and Google Bernie Sanders Zodiac Killer, because those pictures are very, very, very close. Just saying. Anyway, so now let's get into a little bit of a plot that the U.S. government put forward to maybe start a war with Cuba, but to do so in a way to make it look like the Cubans actually started it. And it's eerily similar to something that happened like in a lot of our childhoods. Now we're going to talk about Operation Northwoods. 1962, kind of a strange and very intense time for the world. The Beatles hadn't hit it big yet. Rolling Stones are just starting out. Chubby Checker, Ray Charles, Elvis Presley, they've all got songs in the Billboard Top 20. Also, the US and Russia are in an increasingly warming Cold War that would involve some missile storage in Cuba. But before we get to like the meat of that, there's another little piece of nastiness that kind of took place in 1961 called Operation Mongoose. The CIA starts to like crank up the heat on JFK to get rid of Castro after the completely boo-fooed Bay of Pigs operation. A lot of speculation goes into the total amount of attempts that were made to kill Castro. It's kind of assumed that the first attempt to do this was the Bay of Pigs invasion. But I guess there were some other documented attempts that are even weirder than like trying to invade his country to kill him. One of the things I found that was really, really interesting actually took place before the Bay of Pigs, and it involved the Italian mafia. So, if you've ever watched The Godfather, you'll know that like Cuba was kind of a vacation spot back in the 40s and 50s. And a lot of these like connected guys in the mob owned hotels or casinos there. So they could go back and forth as they wanted and just kind of like live it up. When Castro took control in 1959, he booted the mob out of Cuba. So they've been making bank in Cuba, again, running casinos, hotels, nightclubs, anything touristy focused on the island, these guys have got their hands in. The guys that are running stuff, they're not like no-name, low-level gangsters either. Just to name a few that lost a bunch of money when Castro took over would be Santo Traficante Jr., who was the boss of the Tampa Syndicate. Sam Giancana, who took over the Chicago crew after Al Capone was nabbed for tax evasion because they couldn't get him for anything else. So he didn't pay his taxes. Who cares about the couple hundred people that he ordered killed? He had a who's list of associates, including Santo Traficante Jr., Johnny Rosselli, who he also lost tons of money during the takeover. Jack Ruby was also a little involved with this, so maybe there's a connection there. Frank Sinatra, because old Blue Eyes was hooked up with the mafia pretty good. Matter of fact, if it weren't for the mafia and Frank Sinatra, Las Vegas wouldn't be what it is. Because those guys went out there and were like, this is the middle of the desert. We can kind of do whatever we want except have water because we're in the middle of the desert. So let's just set up a place like full of like hookers and gambling and we're going to make so much money. And they did. Another guy that was kind of involved with this was Joe Kennedy, who was JFK's father, who was a known like bootlegger back in the day, and maybe didn't do some shady stuff during Prohibition, working with some Italian fellas. But probably the best known gangster that was involved with this is one of the best known gangsters of all time, Meyer Lansky. So these guys, they employed the old enemy of my enemy plan. The CIA division chief, James O'Connell, got a hold of former FBI agent Bob Mayhew, who was also doing some under-the-table work for the reclusive billionaire Howard Hughes. Mayhew sets up a meeting between Johnny Roselli, who would eventually contact Sam Giancana and bring him into the fold as well. The three would eventually meet up in Miami, and they came to the conclusion that poisoning would be the best choice to deal with Fidel Castro. An unknown CIA operative would set them up with like half a dozen specially made poison capsules to slip into Fidel Castro's food or drink. If I'm not mistaken, I'm pretty sure Fidel Castro had a weird thing with milk. Like, he loved milk. ADD break. It was actually milkshakes, because he loved ice cream and milk. Matter of fact, I'm going to read you a quick little thing on my other monitor over here. Yes, Fidel Castro had an extreme and well-documented love for milk and dairy products. This obsession led him to develop Cuba's dairy industry, promote quote-unquote super cows like Herba Blanca, and build a massive ice cream parlor called Copella. His passion for dairy was so well known that the CIA once attempted to assassinate him by poisoning his milkshake. Drink your milkshake full of poison. So yeah, they have the option to try to poison a milkshake, which we just talked about. One plot included, and this is probably my absolute favorite assassination plot of all time for Fidel Castro, was to plant a small amount of plastic explosive in a cigar in hopes of it blowing him up, Looney Tunes style. Unfortunately, whoever came up with this plan forgot that plastic explosive isn't necessarily flammable, and you actually have to have a blasting cap and a detonator of some sort. So if you had somebody like watching him with binoculars, and once he gets a stogie and then fires it up and he gets about halfway through, you can be like, with some dude in the bushes with a garage door opener, just clicking the button and hoping it happens. Like that dude that killed Danny Green. After the meeting, they waited and waited for the go order from Washington, but it would never come. Mayhew and Giancana kind of drop off the plan here. And Roselli says, and he sets up a series of commando-style missions into Cuba to try to kill Castro still. And in the process, he actually had 2 boats shot out from underneath him. So this guy's just going to roll up, trying to do like an SAS raid with a bunch of like fellas, you know? Dudes with pinky rings and chest hair hanging out, you know. The partnership between the mob and the CIA would come to an end in 1963. Now, going to get into the big one. A series of meetings took place between the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which are the heads of the Army, Navy, and Air Force. I think now, I could be wrong, but I think now the Joint Chiefs of Staff, they've separated the Navy and Marine Corps, I think. And I don't know that they also have the head of the Space Force in there too. Which, I mean, if it gets us closer to having actual Space Marines, awesome, cool, totally fine with that. But that means we have to find an alien species to kill. We can't just be like, hey, here's a bunch of dudes in space with M16s. What's the point? What's the point of that? We need to go to other planets and teach them about freedom as well. So there's a series of plans drawn up to pull the US and Cuba into further and deeper conflict. The initial meeting took place in late 1962, early 1963, and the plans made are some of the most diabolical and gutless and heartless things the US government has come up to so far at this point in history. So from here, I'm going to read from an actual like declassified document, which you can find for yourself all over the web. I actually have the link for it if you want. I found it at the National Security website. It's an 8-page document. So basically 10 pages if you take the first 2 pages of like fluff out, where those are just 2 pages of like this is where the meeting's held. This is who's at the meeting. This is who's keeping time and like taking notes and blah, 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 all that nonsense. So once we get the backstory out of the way, it's like 8 pages. So for anybody watching on video, I'm going to apologize because I have my actual paperwork for it. And if you hear pages flipping, anybody, and that upsets you, I apologize, but I'm reading it again directly from the document that I have in my hands here. So this is actually entitled Memorandum for Chief of Operations Cuba Project, subject Justification for U.S. Military Intervention in Cuba. Point 1. References made to Memorandum from Chief of Operations Cuba Project for General Craig, subject, quote, Operation Mongoose, date 5 March 1962, which requested brief but precise description of pretext which the Joint Chiefs of Staff consider would provide justification for U.S. military intervention in Cuba. Point 2. The project listed in the enclosed heretofore... The project listed in the enclosure hereto are forwarded as a preliminary submission suitable for planning purposes. It is assumed that It is assumed that there will be similar submissions from other agencies, that these inputs will be used as a basis for developing a time-phased plan. The individual... Jeepers creepers, I can't read. I might need to actually get my glasses for this. Holy crap. I haven't had to do that in a minute. Point 3. This plan, incorporating projects selected from the attached suggestions or from other sources, should be developed to focus all efforts on a specific ultimate objective, which would provide adequate justification for U.S. military intervention. And I'll apologize if my reading sounds terrible. It's because this is like copies of a typewriter. So it's hard. It's very hard to read. It's almost as bad as trying to read like an old newspaper article that's been copied 1,000 times. Such a plan would enable a logical buildup of incidents to combine with other seemingly unrelated events to camouflage the ultimate objective and create the necessary impression of Cuban rashness and irresponsibility on a large scale, directed at other countries as well as the United States. Plan would also properly integrate and time phase the course of action to be pursued. The desired result from the execution of this plan would be to place the United States in the apparent position of suffering deniable grievances from a rash and irresponsible government of Cuba and to develop an international image of a Cuban threat to peace in the Western Hemisphere. So, if you're not picking up what I'm laying down, we are talking false flag operations. Admitted to in a unclassified document from the United States government. Also, another place you can find this is if you have a copy of the Jesse Ventura book. It's like 18 documents that the government doesn't want you to know or whatever. Jesse Ventura may be crazy, but he's also right. So, same with Alex Jones. Alex Jones is kind of an asshole, but he's also right about a lot of the stuff that he says. He's not right about the stuff that got him sued. Not defending that. Like all the weird government stuff that he talked about for decades, a lot of it he was right about. Like, you may not like the guy. You don't have to like the guy. It's fine. But he's been right about a lot of stuff. Unfortunately for the normies out there that don't want to go down rabbit holes and whatnot. Point 4. This is an important factor in resolution of the Cuban problem. The Cuban problem being Cuba. Therefore, the plan should be so time-phased that projects would be operable within the next few months. Point 5, and I love this word, inasmuch as the ultimate objective is overt military intervention, it is recommended that primary responsibility for developing military and paramilitary aspects of the plan for both overt and covert military operations be assigned to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So we don't want some dingus in an office somewhere in Langley coming up with this plan. We want the heads of the military to come up with this plan. Annex to appendix to enclosure. Whew. a pretext to justify U.S. military intervention in Cuba. I'm not going to read the note. That doesn't make any difference. The note is basically just kind of going over what we just talked about. Point 1 on this page. Since it would seem desirable to use legitimate provocation as the basis for U.S. military intervention in Cuba, a covert and deception plan to include requisite preliminary action such as has been developed in response to Task 33 could be executed as an initial effort to provoke Cuban reactions. Harassment plus deceptive actions to convince the Cubans of immediate invasion would be emphasized. Our military posture throughout execution of this plan will allow a rapid change from exercise to intervention if Cuban response justifies. Point 2. A series of well-coordinated incidents will be planned to take place in and around Guantanamo to give genuine appearance of being done by hostile Cuban forces. Shocker. A. Incidents to establish a credible attack, not in chronological order. Subsection 1. Start rumors, many. Use clandestine radio. Subsection 2. Land friendly Cubans in uniform, quote, over the fence to stage attacks on the base. Subsection 3. Capture Cuban, friendly saboteurs inside the base. So basically, we want to send fake Cuban spies in for us to capture. To say that, oh, they're sending spies in. Here's proof. Kind of like that time that the Germans killed a Polish guy and put him in a military uniform and then dragged him across the border into Germany to say that Poland invaded them. Then a thing happened. Whatever. We're talking about Cuba. Subsection 4. Start riots near the base main gate. Friendly Cubans. So again, I don't want to use the term crisis actors, but that's basically what they're trying to do. Subsection 5. Blow up ammunition inside the base. Start fires. Subsection 6. Burn aircrafts on airbase. In brackets, sabotage. Subsection 7. Lob mortar shells from outside of base into base. Some damage to installations. So attack yourself, but from a distance, to make it look like Cuba did something. Interesting. Subsection 8. Capture assault teams approaching from the sea or vicinity of Guantanamo City. Probably also friendlies, I would assume. They didn't go into note on that. Subsection 9. Capture militia group which storms the base. Subsection 10. Sabotage ships in harbor, large fires, using naphthalene, which that might be the Christian name for napalm. I'm not sure. Super quick, ADD break. My God, I'm going to get put on a no-fly list. Oh man! Once my NSA agent finally decides to go through my browser histories and be like, "Oh no, this guy's going to be a problem." Anyway, so we're using naphthalene, which I thought was part of napalm. It's not. Subsection 11. Sink ships near harbor entrance. Conduct funerals for mock victims. Point B. United States would respond by executing offensive operations to secure water and power supplies, destroying artillery and mortar emplacements which threaten the base. Subsection Point C. Commence large-scale United States military operations. Point 3. A quote-unquote remember the Maine incident could be arranged in several forms. So, the Maine is the ship that was sunk in Cuba that was the catalyst for us getting into the Spanish-American War. Pretty sure because Teddy Roosevelt went down there and just like kicked a bunch of Cuban dicks into the ground. Which I don't care where you fall politically or about like justification of war or anything like that. Teddy Roosevelt is a goddamn American hero. And I won't take any argument on that. Anyway, so, and of course the Maine was allegedly sunk by the Spanish. Very good chance it was actually sunk by us to get involved in the war or something like that. Who knows? Subsection A from that. We could blow up a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay and blame Cuba. Part B, we could blow up a drone or unmanned vessel anywhere in Cuban waters. We could arrange to cause such incident in the vicinity of Havana or Santiago as a spectacular result of Cuban attacks from the air or sea or both. The presence of Cuban planes or ships merely investigating the intent of the vessel could be fairly compelling evidence that the ship was taken under attack. The nearness to Havana or Santiago would add credibility, especially to those people that might have heard the blast or even seen the fire. The U.S. could follow up with an air/sea rescue operation covered by U.S. fighters to, quote, evacuate remaining members of the non-existent crew. Casualty lists in U.S. newspapers would cause a helpful wave of national indignation. So, I'm not surprised that the government would do this. I'm way more surprised that they would have ever unclassified this document, admitting that they would do this. And it's really gross to be like, hey, we could just pretend to kill a bunch of our own people to start a war. Whereas if you want to wait 20, 30 years, 40 years, whatever, we could maybe potentially actually kill a bunch of our own people to justify going to war, and then go to war in another country after we get false information from an ally in the area about WMDs to get rid of a guy that we maybe kind of put in place in the first place. That's become a problem because he doesn't want to nationalize his banks and stuff. Yeah, he's a maniac, but, you know, it's all about the money. The human life cost means nothing. It's all about the money. Always is. Point 4, we could develop a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, or even in Washington. The terror campaign could be pointed at Cuban refugees seeking haven in the United States. So now we're going to kill Cuban refugees to make it look like Cuban terrorists did it. We could sink a boatload of Cubans en route to Florida, real or simulated. Probably be hard to simulate it because they could like make up a bunch of names and then be like, oh, these people were all killed. And then the Cubans could go, these people don't actually exist. We could foster attempts on lives of Cuban refugees in the United States, even to the extent of wounding in instances to be widely publicized. Exploding a few plastic bombs in carefully chosen spots, the arrest of Cuban agents, and the release of prepared documents substantiating Cuban involvement also would be helpful in projecting the idea of an irresponsible government. Doing a pretty good job of proving that we may be talking about an irresponsible government. Point 5, a, quote, Cuban-based Castro-supported filibuster could be simulated against a neighboring Caribbean nation, in brackets, in the vein of the 14th of June invasion of the Dominican Republic. We know that Castro is backing subversive efforts clandestinely against Haiti, Dominican Republic, Guatemala, and Nicaragua at present, and possibly others. We don't need to be involved with anything in Haiti to make the country ruin itself because it's already been doing that for like 200 years. At one point in time, they went through like 59 presidents in like 6 years or something like that. Dan Daly episode mentioned that. Holy crap, that was a minute ago. These efforts can be magnified and additional ones contrived for exposure. For example, advantage can be taken of the sensitivity of the Dominican Air Force to intrusions within their national airspace. Quote-unquote, Cuban B-26s or C-46 type aircraft could make cane burning raids at night. And we say quote unquote Cuban because we're just going to use our B-26s and paint them like Cubans. Soviet bloc incendiaries could be found, of course. This could be coupled with, quote, Cuban messages to the communist underground in the Dominican Republic and, quote unquote, Cuban shipments of arms, which would be found or intercepted on the beach. Because we'll just wash up a crate of guns and pretend that they came from there instead of us planting them there. And don't get me wrong, I love this country. I love America. I love everything that it stands for. I love everybody that I love American people. Our government is awful, and it always has been. Well, not always. At one point in time, it was actually pretty rad, and then they killed the last real president that we would have, and then everybody else has just been puppets for special interest groups and foreign nations and companies since then. Just saying. And I'm not a Democrat or anything, but JFK was pretty rad. Point 6. Use of MiG-type aircrafts by U.S. pilots could provide additional provocation. Harassment of civil air, attacks on surface shipping, and destruction of U.S. military drone aircraft by MiG-type planes would be useful as a complementary action. An F-86 properly painted would convince air passengers that they saw a Cuban MiG, especially if the pilot of the transport were to announce such fact. So basically, we're going to paint this thing up vaguely to look Cuban, and then have the pilot come over the thing. This is your captain speaking. If you look out the right side of the airplane, you'll see a Cuban MiG. The primary drawback to this suggestion appears to be the security risk inherent in obtaining or modifying an aircraft. Because we don't just have MiGs floating around. We would have had to steal one from a Soviet country. Not that easy to do. However, reasonable copies of the MiG could be produced from U.S. resources in about 3 months. Because everybody knows the MiG is the Volkswagen Jetta of aircrafts. We can just build a body kit for this bitch and make it look cool. Point 7. Hijacking attempts against civil air and surface craft. Point 8. It is possible to create an incident which will demonstrate convincingly that a Cuban aircraft has attacked and shot down a chartered civil airline en route from the United States to Jamaica, Guatemala, Panama, or Venezuela. The destination would be chosen only to cause the flight plan route to cross Cuban airspace. The passengers could be a group of college students off on a holiday or any group of persons with a common interest to support chartering a non-scheduled flight. So you could have also been like, oh, these are like Christian missionaries that are going down to build a church or get some town running water, which that would have been a good one to get people really behind it. Subsection 8 of that. An aircraft at Elgin Air Force Base would be painted and numbered as an exact duplicate for a civilian registered aircraft belonging to a CIA proprietary organization in the Miami area. At a designated time, the duplicate would be substituted for the actual civil aircraft and would be loaded with the selected passengers, all boarded under carefully prepared aliases. The actual registered aircraft would be converted to a drone, meaning they would just set it up to be remote-controlled aircraft. Subsection B. Takeoff times of the drone aircraft and the actual aircraft will be scheduled to allow a rendezvous south of Florida. So you want them to cross paths before you get over Cuban airspace so that we can land the one with the actual people on it right around the same time as the other one is up to the correct altitude to be going over Cuba. From the rendezvous point, the passenger-carrying aircraft will descend to minimum altitude and go directly into an auxiliary field at Elgin Air Force Base, where arrangements will have been made to evacuate the passengers and return that aircraft to its original status. The drone aircraft, meanwhile, will continue to fly the filed flight plan. When over Cuba, the drone will be transmitting on an international distress frequency a, quote, Mayday message stating it is under attack by Cuban MiG aircraft. The transmission will be interrupted by destruction of the aircraft, which will be triggered by radio signal. So we are going to fly this over Cuban airspace, play a fake message that is being attacked, and then blow it up. This will allow radio stations in the Western Hemisphere to tell the U.S. what happened to the aircraft instead of the U.S. trying to, quote, sell the incident. Boy, man, if you can get through all of this and not get pissy, then you're better than me, because I'm pretty. I've read this before, and I'm like, this is gross. This is really gross. Point 9. It is possible to create an incident which will make it appear that communist Cuban MiGs have destroyed a United States Air Force craft over international waters in an unprovoked attack. Subsection A to that, approximately 4 or 5 F-101 aircraft will be dispatched and trail from Homestead Air Force Base, Florida, to the vicinity of Cuba. Their mission will be to reverse course and to simulate Fakir aircraft, which are they would have been a communist-built plane, for an air defense exercise in South Florida. These aircraft would conduct variation of these flights at frequent intervals. Crews would be briefed to remain at least 12 miles off the Cuban coast. However, they would be required to carry live ammunition in the event that hostile action was taken by Cuban MiGs. So, basically, we're going to fly toward Cuba on like an exercise flight, get about 12 miles off, then jump back. And we're going to pretend that at some point doing this caused a Cuban aircraft to go, what are these guys doing? Take flight and go up and shoot one of them down. But we have to have live ammunition in the aircraft just in case this actually happens and we can defend ourselves. Subsection B. On one such flight, a pre-briefed pilot would fly tail end Charlie at considerable intervals between aircraft. So one of these guys is going to break off and kind of come way, way back behind everybody else and fly the rest of the way back way behind everybody else. Well, near the Cuban island, this pilot would broadcast that he had been jumped by MiGs and was going down. No other calls would be made. The pilot would then fly directly west at extremely low altitude to stay underneath radar and land at a secure base at an Elgin auxiliary runway. The aircraft would be met by the proper people, quickly stored and given a new tail number. The pilot who had performed this mission under an alias would resume his proper identity and return to his normal place of business. So we're making up a U.S. serviceman to kill. The pilot and aircraft would have to be disappeared. Subsection C. At precisely the same time that the aircraft was presumably shot down, a submarine or small surface craft would disperse F-101 parts, parachutes, etc. at approximately 15 to 20 miles off the Cuban coast and then depart. God, what a scummy thing to do. The pilots returning to Homestead would have a true story as far as they knew. So we're not even going to tell the other dudes about this. The only person that's privy to the fact that this guy is getting fake shot down is the guy that's getting fake shot down. So the rest of his boys are like, dude, they actually shot him down. We got to go back. And then they get back to base, and Bill is just like chilling out, eating a sandwich, and he's like, what's going on, guys? I beat you back here. Don't know how that happened. I must have hit some of that Bermuda Triangle electric fog and just zoomed past you. Search ships and aircraft could be dispatched, and parts of aircraft could be found. Enclosure B. Facts bearing on the problem. Subsection 1. The Joint Chiefs of Staff have previously stated that U.S. unilateral military intervention in Cuba can be undertaken in the event that the Cuban regime commit hostile acts against U.S. forces or property which would serve as an incident upon which to base overt intervention. Subsection 2. The need for positive action in the event that current covert affairs to foster an internal Cuban rebellion are unsuccessful was indicated by the Joint Chiefs of Staff on 7 March 1962 as follows. Determination that a credible international revolt is impossible of attainment during the next 9 to 10 months will require a decision by the United States to develop a Cuban quote-unquote provocation as justification for positive U.S. military action. Subsection 3. It is understood that the Department of State also is preparing suggested courses of action to develop justification for U.S. military intervention in Cuba. Okay. So that was a lot, right? Sorry, I have a giant pile of notes in my filing cabinet. So, after all that, keep in mind, JFK shot this entire idea down in the first quarter of 1963. So within the first 4 months of 1963, he shot this whole thing down. We're not doing this. I don't like this idea. I don't like communism, but I don't want to create an international incident that would require us to do this because it's just not what we do as America. Looking back at it now, it's not what we did as America. Now, different story. JFK was killed on November 22nd, 1963, which some think that his death was due to him starting to lay off the whole Cuba thing. Because he kind of hit that mindset of, they're not really doing anything threatening. We got our people back. What's the point of continuing to poke these guys? As soon as he's killed, Lyndon B. Johnson took over as the president on the same day, obviously. Lee Harvey Oswald, the alleged assassin, was killed November 24th in 1963. Jack Ruby, the man who killed the president, died, quote unquote, of cancer January 3rd, 1964. Now, another little thing that happened right in that same area. August 2nd, 1964, the USS Maddox was allegedly attacked by an NVA, North Vietnamese Army torpedo ship. You may have heard the air quotes that I threw in there. That's because the attack either didn't happen the way it was reported or it didn't happen at all. The reason that it's important is because this is what would become known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident. And this would be the direct lead-in to the deaths of over 58,000 young American men in the jungles of Vietnam and nearly 4 million Vietnamese people, including civilians. This was the catalyst to get us to go to war in Vietnam, was this ship being attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin. Now, all of that goes to prove that the government will do terrible things to itself to get what it wants. We have set the precedent with Operation Northwoods, where, again, we're willing to hurt ourselves to make a point to go do something else. And we're willing to throw out the idea of possibly using hijacked or remote-controlled aircraft to use as weapons against the U.S. Because part of the other thing with part of Operation Northwoods was one of these ideas was to paint up a 727 or whatever, some kind of a passenger aircraft, and then crash it into like Miami somewhere and hit a building and cause an issue like that. So now that that's been set super quickly, I wanted to talk about Global Guardian and Vigilant Guardian. Now is the time, if you are anywhere near it, to grab your Reynolds wrap. These are joint exercises run between the FAA and the North American Aerospace Defense Command, or NORAD. And these were like yearly exercises that had been held in the years before. When they'd run these operations in the previous years, they were called Operation Vigilant Eagle. And that was to simulate a Russian bomber attack on a North American city. This kind of the one in 2001 coincided with the Russian 37th Air Army running bombing tests in the Arctic and the Atlantic at the same time. Former LAPD officer and writer Michael Rupert said that Vigilant Guardian was actually, quote, a hijacking drill, not a Cold War exercise. The drill involved hijacking airliners rather than Russian bombers. On the day of September 11th, 2001, Lieutenant Colonel Kevin Nasapani was sitting in the NORAD control room when he was told about the hijacking and said, quote, somebody started the exercise early. So he's talking about the hijacking of one of the planes out of Logan that would eventually hit the World Trade Center. He told author Michael Bronner, quote, the day's exercise was designed to run a range of scenarios, including a quote-unquote traditional simulated hijack in which politically motivated perpetrators commandeered an aircraft, land on a Cuba-like island, and seek asylum. According to the 9/11 Commission report, which honestly, after reading some of it, is not worth the paper that it's printed on. It's butt covering at its absolute finest. These exercises caused a slow response to the attacks, which, because you have to scramble aircraft, and these guys have to be in the know about the exercise. Then when you're scrambling the aircraft, they're like, oh, this is part of the exercise. And then they get up there and they're like, wait a minute, is it? And then there's really no straight answer out of anybody. If you get to page 17 of this absolute piece of shit that is the 9/11 Commission report, there's a section about the FAA's Boston Control Center putting a call into into the Northeast Air Defense Sector, which is NEADS, to which NEADS asked, is this real world or exercise? So this other organization also has absolutely no clue if the call coming in from the FAA in Boston about a hijacked airplane is real or part of this exercise. More than once, things have been planned as exercises which simulate an event, and then that exact same event takes place that same day. I'm pretty sure the 7/7 bombings in London, the same day they were also running like some kind of a counterterrorism exercise about bombings in a train station and on buses and stuff. And it happened exactly how they were planning it in the exercise the same day. Man, oh man. Wait till I decide to do a 9/11 episode, because that's gonna be crazy. We'll have to talk about how multiple, hundreds of survivors reported hearing explosions after the planes hit and being like, yeah, the plane hit, the building's really not on fire, then holy, I just heard an explosion. Why did I hear an explosion? Then how the buildings collapsed, and how Building 7 didn't even get hit by anything, but that still somehow fell. But there was all kinds of government offices in there. And Larry Silverstein, who owned the property, how he had put in a bunch of push trades against all these different airline companies and some of the companies that had holdings in the trade centers. And he made a ton of money off of that. He also made $900 million off of the insurance claim on the entire property, because everything that he owned was destroyed. We'll talk about how the hijackers were here for years beforehand, and at one point in time there was a Mossad team tracking these guys where they lived less than a block away from where the hijackers were in California. It's wild. And then there's the BBC report of Building 7 collapsing 25 minutes before it actually did. It's the woman's on TV talking about the building collapsing. You can still see it behind her. Then there's the dancing Israelis that were all arrested and eventually shipped home through strange means. Yeah, that might be an episode that I get in trouble for. I'm not sure. But I'm definitely going to be on a watch list after it. So this episode went a lot longer than I expected it to. But I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed the fact that we got to do a little, got to go down some rabbit holes, talk about awful, awful stuff that the U.S. government would totally never do, but maybe already did in our lifetimes, to get involved with things. Because, like, honestly, we really had no interest in going into Vietnam before the Gulf of Tonkin. Kind of like we really had no interest in going into Afghanistan before 9/11, or that like all the hijackers are Saudi Arabian, and the guy that planned it was Saudi Arabian, and the people that financed it were Saudi Arabian. But we went to Afghanistan. But we're buddies with Saudi Arabia. Like, we get a bunch of money from them for a bunch of stuff. Strange how that works. Or again, we went to Iraq for WMDs after a certain gentleman that's a president of a very small country in the region said, "Hey, they've got WMDs," even though he already didn't like Saddam Hussein or the Iraqis because they were a quote unquote threat to his country. And then we went there and got a bunch of guys shot and killed and all up. And our greatest ally in the region sent exactly 0 troops or support to help us. But I mean, the Brits and Australians did. So thanks, you guys. You guys are awesome. But you know, that other place that's right there wouldn't let us even set up like aid stations. We had to fly guys to Germany, which is a lot further away than Israel. Anyway, so hopefully everybody had fun. I enjoyed it, sort of. I had fun doing the research. I got annoyed having to read government documents where they just straight up admit that they would commit terrorist attacks against themselves. But if you enjoyed it, if you want this early, maybe not you can't get this one early because you've already listened to it. If you want the next episode early, go over to Patreon, patreon.com/1159media. $5 a month gets you early access to every show on the network. History Goon, Guessnicity with Luther, Almost Fiction with Chase, The Never Daily with Sam and Chase, 911 calls with the operator. And it also gets you backdoor access to Never Daily and 911 and Guessnicity. Not to me, because I've been sitting here recording for like 2.5 hours. And part of that was like I just stopped because I had to go do other stuff real quick. Nobody wants to watch me do this live. And if you do, don't, because it's a bad idea. Also, if you want to help me help somebody else, go over to Ko-Fi, ko-fi.com/historygoonpod. Any money donated between, I believe it was like middle of November and January 1st, any money that you guys donate to me through that, I'm going to donate to a local dog rescue that's run by one of my friends. She's doing very good things, and just want to try to help out a little bit. So if you want to throw a couple bucks at it, that's awesome. If you don't, that's, you know, it is what it is. Just be known that if you're going to donate to it before the beginning of next year, I'm not keeping any of the money. It's going directly to a friend to help her with her dog stuff. I think that's it. Next time we come back, it may be 2 episodes. Oh, this next one may be 2 episodes. Seems to happen when I cover an evil, evil piece of shit from history that ends up being 2 episodes. We don't even have to go to Belgium this time either. Like, we're going to stay right here in the US. We're going to head south, though, and back to like the 1860s. So it's unfortunate because he was a really good general. It's unfortunate that he was such a turd of a person, and he was legitimately evil. But God, he was a good general. If he could have just not been a piece of shit and just been a really good military leader, it would have been totally different. But, and it's hard to say where he was worse. Was it before or after the war? Because he's bad at both points. In that one, oh boy. Ooh, you're going to hear me say some stuff about the author of a book that I used. And I mean every word of it. an absolute apologist, which is disgusting. But until then, we're all going to die someday. So go out and do some goon shit and leave a mark in the world. Just like the CIA, if they're listening. Love you, bye.